Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Become a paid subscriber on the Substack. Best way to support me, and choosing the annual option is the best deal for you. Joining us on Geopolitics and Empire is the one, the only William Ramsey of William Ramsey Investigates. He's an attorney, author, researcher, filmmaker, podcaster. He's got a number of books, but we'll be discussing his first book, Prophet of Evil, Aleister Crowley, 9/11, and the New World Order. Welcome to the podcast, William.
Boy, thanks for the invite. Glad to be with you.
You know, you and I have known each other for a few years now. You've been on my TNT show. We hung out in LA a few years back, and I want to show on screen that we are.
Hey, we got some pictures. All right.
You and
Sweet.
me and Michael Parker, right? I mean, just amazing times, amazing story. And you guys have chatted and you've been on each other's podcasts, cool. And so that was good fun. And I've been on your podcast. So it's your first time on Geopolitics and Empire, and I finally had time to get through your first book. I've got your Global Death Cult, which is another one of your books. Maybe we can talk about in a subsequent podcast. But for listeners who maybe are not aware of you, whatever you want to tell us about yourself, your background, and the work you're doing.
Well, you covered some of it. I mean, I had kind of a different career. I went to law school in D.C. It's now called Scalia. When I went there, it was a reformed shopping mall. It was a total dump. But I got my law degree, passed the bar in 98. But I got kind of an inside view of D.C., so I was very suspect being there during the Clinton administration, which really was like the House of Cards. Like the House of Cards is not that much fiction. It's a little more nonfiction and fiction melded together. Anyway, so that kind of led me to kind of be very suspect about the corporate media and standard media. So I did a lot of research on my own. 9/11 happened. I believe the hype, and maybe a couple of years later, I was like, hey, there's something really wrong with this. And so that led me on another kind of research jag. So I was really kind of an independent researcher. I really consider myself an independent 9/11 researcher who never really put anything out into the public. But I would listen to, like, back in the old school podcasted universe of like Visigoth's Grassy Knoll and things like that. All the guests they had, like 9/11 Truth for Utica Truth, and a lot of early researchers there. So I would listen to them, and really that compilation of all that research into 9/11 led to this, my first book, which was self-published, and like you said, the title is Prophet of Evil, Aleister Crowley, 9/11 and the New World Order. I didn't know much about Aleister Crowley. I'd grown up listening to, popular music, Ozzy Osbourne's Mr. Crowley. I had no idea. I had a very superficial knowledge. And through kind of just listening, people would say, oh, he was a dabbler in the occult, so I would absorb that. I was like, okay, a dabbler, nice. And then I started, to get to this book, to the point of self-publishing this book in 2010, I read almost every biography available, Sutin, Kaczynski, some of these other ones, assignments who knew Crowley, and then read the original manuscripts of Crowley as much as I could. He was incredible output. He put out an incredible amount of literature, if you call it that. But, and it led me to a completely different conclusion. Like, he was not a dabbler in any way, shape, or form. He dedicated his whole life to that. And so I had a different take than some of these other, whether it was an academic or somebody who was empathetic towards Crowley. I had a completely different view, which kind of like was another reason to publish this book and get kind of my view from a Christian perspective. Like, I'm 100% Christian. Jesus Christ is the Messiah. So it was easy for me to kind of see this in a Christian kind of lens, is like this black magician, occultist, who really hated Christianity and Christ. So that was also suffuses the whole book. So that's kind of the lead up to that. And then I was really a guest for on most people's podcasts, fringe Christian podcasts, the guys I still chat with, like from the underground, and who I chat with recently. An old friend, Johnny. Shout out to Johnny, who called me, said I had the personality of a cardboard box. That's my friend. Anyway, so some of these earlier French Christians, I was a guest. And then I started working with Ed Opperman, and was a producer for him for 3 years, kind of working for him. We had very similar interests, similar kind of research interests and stuff like that. And then I kind of flipped into a host, and then COVID happened. I really became a host and continued to publish books. And Documentaries on subjects I was interested in. So it's been 5 books now. Global Death Cult is my second to most recent book. I published another one about a phenomenon called the Smiley Face Killers that's happening all around the world. And that was published in 2023. It's 400 pages, way too long. But that's kind of the sum. My podcast, William Ramsey Investigates, is now in the top 0.5 podcasts in the world. I guess that puts me in the top 20,000 maybe podcasts in the world, and I had like over 200,000 downloads last month, and I've had over like probably 6-7 million. I can't figure out, because I've been censored so much, how many total downloads on all platforms, but it's been a lot. So I've been fortunate that there's people who are interested in kind of when I started, I was really underground fringe, like Samizdat or some kind of like underground things. And interestingly, I published my first book on an 8x10 page because I just printed it out. So it was really it had an underground feel to it, but it's kind of morphed. It's been ripped off, and it's still around, and people still out like you. It's been 15 years still interested in the subject matter. So.
And Crowley was known as the beast, in tongue in cheek here. You're a beast when it comes to podcasting. You're turning out so much content, and I wasn't aware. I'm also in the top 0.5%, and you were the first to make me realize that I'm also ranked there, and so I had no idea. And again, your book it's insane. Like, Crowley was an insane man, and it's a great introduction where you summarize so much stuff. There's a lot of primary source material there, and I highly recommend people go out and purchase your book if they're interested in Crowley, in the New World Order, in the occult, and then they can go to your references to dish off to other stuff. I saw you recently on Delingpole, and I was mesmerized by that conversation, that deep dive, and that's sort of what I've been meaning to touch more on these topics, and so I'm like, I gotta get William on. And just one more thing before getting into Crowley, I've noticed this trend. I recently watched David Hughes with Patrick Wood and Catherine Austin Fitz. They did the Omnivore webinar, and he mentioned how he obtained his PhD, he obtained finally a position in academia, and he just decided to leave. You left the profession. When I graduated in international relations, I'm like, I taught for a while, but then I ultimately also decided to leave and do my own thing, podcasting, and coming to this realization that whether it's, working as an attorney, working in government, working in academia, it's all captured. And the only place that you can search for truth is on the fringes. No, just any thought on that?
I think you're 100% right. Like, you had to toe a certain line, even in certainly academia. Like, nobody from academia could be on my podcast. I think it's just way too shrill of a universe. You can't really have independent thought. And I saw that a lot in law school too. Like, very much like you had just one thought process at one school and another at another school too. And those people hung out and they hated each other, right and left, really at each other's throats. Not much different today in politics. So I think that politics really does matter. So I don't know if I really even consciously came to the fringe. It just was something like, I can't tell my stories here. I have to find the others. And I was kind of like found kind of really an underground. And so I think that I was very fortunate. A lot of those guys are still my old buddies, and we follow each other online and stuff. So it's been it's interesting to watch everything morph and this podcast grow and these new people. And one guy called it the alternative mainstream media, which I think is accurate, because it's kind of like the mainstream media moved into the alternate. So there's almost like 3 tiers: mainstream, alternative, mainstream, and then the alternative. But
I want to get your further thoughts on that towards the end. But what else was going to say? I mean, you can think of other examples. The Swiss historian Daniele Ganser, who I've interviewed, I mean, he was ran out of academia, and he started his own institute, and he became wildly successful, more so than if he had stayed in academia. And so it's like, what we have to do is we have to strike out on our own, self-publish, and find ways to become financially successful, to pursue the truth. And so, starting with Crowley, I got a lot of talking points here, but maybe in the beginning, when he was young, you kind of go chronologically throughout his life. He was raised in this maybe kind of strange Christian household, this Plymouth Brethren, and then he had been to these schools where he was like physically, even tortured and abused. I mean, they kind of went off the deep end there. They crossed the line, but eventually his mother, you write that his mother christened him the beast. And, even in his early age, he was turning towards the dark side, and she was trying to get him to come back as a prodigal son, but she couldn't succeed. Just, from what is, to summarize from the early days, what's important, interesting.
There's a lot there. Like, he grew up as an only son of a very privileged household in a different kind of offshoot of Christianity. He was part of the Plymouth Brethren, but really a subset, the exclusive Brethren, under Darby. So, there's a lot of questions about dispensationalism and Darby's theology that should be questioned. I have a lot of questions about that. So he's involved in this environment, but his dad was a pamphleteer. He came from a very wealthy family who sold beer and other things at pubs. So he never really had to work his entire life. His father died when he was 12. He loved his father, and then his mother, who he didn't care for, and his uncle raised him and kind of set him off, like you said, down a dark path. But he went to these schools right at the height of it. It's important that his time, the ascent of Crowley, happened at the time of the ascent of the British Empire. So you have this aristocratic guy from a kind of fringe Christian group who has all the benefits growing up in this aristocratic environment, and then goes to the dark side. But he, like you said, he was at what they would call public schools in the UK. They're really private schools, but beaten up, almost like something from Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall, like serious abuse where he almost died. And then he was in the care of tutors, and then eventually went off to Cambridge. But I think his early years were very important formatively. He blew up. He was playing with fireworks and blew up in his face and went into a coma. Some people have speculated that it may have given him brain damage. And if you see pictures of Crowley, you'll see a very prominent pockmark on his face, and pockmarks, that's from that explosion. That's where he had it. So he has kind of very distinctive facial characteristics. And he also had strange things with a cat. He killed a cat. There's a famous episode that he admits to testing whether cats have 9 lives. So he did that at a very young age. So you see this kind of maybe a kind of a little bit of a twist, or a very serious twist of Crowley at a very early age. And then it kind of set him off that dark path where he was a rebel against Christianity. And he said, I wanted to find Satan and become his chief of staff. So he made these decisions at a very early age to really kind of be a rebel. And I think he carried it on all the way to the end, 1875 when he was born, and then dead in 1947 after World War II.
And so you do a thorough job of detailing his life. And then, in my notes here next, I have the Theosophical Society, Blavatsky, and I wanted to read a quote. And one thing that struck me, what you included here about Blavatsky, who the Lucifer magazine, that towards the end of Crowley's life, I find that a lot of these people, they turn to evil. Eventually, they become sort of sad, pathetic, rife with frauds. Some of the other groups that you mentioned as well, there's just so much fraud. In the end, it's just they go to this evil. And there's other quotes as well from your book that say, in the end, it seems like Crowley didn't even believe in anything, almost like it was all for nothing. And in your book, it's written, quote, Blavatsky subsequently moved her group to India, convinced that holy Indian gurus of Hinduism possessed valuable secrets. Eventually, an investigator from the influential Society for Psychical Research in London visited Blavatsky's Theosophic Center in Adyar, India, shocked by the discovery of secret panels and trapdoors used to trick credulous guests. The investigator left India convinced the madame was a fraud. He writes, for our part, we regard her neither as the mouthpiece of hidden seers, nor as a mere vulgar adventuress. We think that she has achieved a title to permanent remembrance as one of the most accomplished, ingenious, and interesting impostors of history. Eventually, Blavatsky returned to London to live out her last years. Too fat to walk, she spent her final days receiving visitors and consuming hashish in her London studio. So, what's interesting or key for you when it comes to Theosophy, the Theosophical Society, Blavatsky, and how that imprints on Crowley?
I think it's because he's growing up at this time where East was meeting West. So it's a time where Eastern ideas, philosophies were all kind of becoming in vogue. I think that Blavatsky helped kind of popularize those. And I think Crowley was part of that too. It's kind of a fusing, in his religion, it was kind of a fusing of a lot of Eastern ideas. And you can see him, like, there's famous pictures of, well, not famous, there's pictures of him doing yogic poses. He wrote a book on yoga, and he was interested in Hinduism and I Ching. He had I Ching sticks. So I think but he, in his kind of corpus that he recommended to magical devotees, he had included, I think it was called The Vision and the Voice by Blavatsky. So he actually had a high regard for her, even though she was kind of exposed later. But she had a lot of influential followers too, leading up to people who, like, Crowley was in contact, like, fighting against. I think he knew Bailey, but there was this Indian kind of guy who he was fighting again. He had a long Indian last name, but he was, like, supposed to be the world teacher, and Crowley was, like, battling him. He wanted to be the world teacher instead. So this whole Blavatsky environment that he was in, within this kind of environment where Blavatsky and her group were kind of ascendant, as well as Crowley was being ascendant.
And there was a lot of ego too, so they were all fighting amongst themselves to be, I think, of importance. And it seemed like, would you say the common thread between, we can mention later the OTO, Blavatsky, what Crowley was doing, and others, the common thread is, it seems like this was the beginning of this birthing of what we can talk about later, this new world religion, and they're all talking about a world teacher, a world leader. Would you say sort of that's what they were all they had in common?
I think so. I think that there was always this kind of the maitreya kind of concept. So I think that Crowley himself saw himself in that environment, and so did Blavatsky and her followers. They're trying to find this new world leader, world teacher, and so I think that, and it's still kind of around. I mean, it goes Benjamin Krem. I don't know if you heard that name. He's passed away, but it's all associated with, like, the Lucis Trust and all these guys, all the way to the present. So Barbara Marx Hubbard. So I think they're all part of that new age theme for sure.
Yeah, Lucis Trust continues to publish about this in their newsletter, talking about this coming Maitreya and world teacher. They say that he's here already, and so it's not sure when he'll be unveiled for the 10th time already. And Magick with a K. I forget what year. You mentioned at some point later, Crowley was, I forget which part of the world, and he's writing a treatise, and he decides to add the letter K to Magick. And I'm curious, from all your research, how magical really do you think is his magic with a K? I think in some ways it seems like what he was trying to do was, he riffed off the Bible so many times. We know that often this is the case with Satan and Lucifer, and he's not original. He doesn't have many original thoughts, so he just kind of riffs off of God, and it made me think of the power that was what the apostles talk about in the New Testament. If you have enough faith, you can do miracles. And you write here in the Goetia, I don't know how you pronounce that the 72 chief demons each command additional legions of evil spirits, and the book describes how to bind these spirits and use them. Solomon promises us that we can obtain information, destroy our enemies, understand the voices of nature, obtain treasure, heal diseases. And it says Mathers also published an important work on the ancient Hebrew mystical work, the Kabbalah Unveiled, drawing from various traditions when he created the Golden Dawn system, including the magical traditions of Egypt, the Hebrew Kabbalah, the Tarot, medieval and Renaissance esotericism. So, how magical do you think was what they were doing? And I guess this is another question. I mean, I think they were really interacting with spirits, and something supernatural was going on there. No,
I think so. I think that's really what he was doing, was really trying to contact spirits from the very beginning. The guy who became the world teacher, his name was Jiddu Krishnamurti. He was kind of a high caste Indian who ended up in, of all places, Ojai, California, like many of the other people who admired Crowley. But I think Crowley was always trying to contact spirits, and he was trying to astral travel, and he claimed to astral travel. So I think that was really his thing. And if you read through the book, you'll see all these different discarnate spirits he's talking to, whether it's Aiwass or the magician is one, or Choronzon, or all these other kind of things that he's writing about. He was very dutiful, as like somebody said that he had the kind of work ethic of a Protestant, as a Satanist. And I think that's correct. Like, he had all kinds of recordings and he had magical records, which are very, very revealing. And they talk about him just trying to contact spirits and break on through to the other side. So I think that whether he did that or not is an open question, but so many things that have happened kind of validate his things. Like, he would have these things called workings, which are magical events, like magic with a K, different than magic, like from pulling a rabbit from a hat or something. But he would have these magical workings, and then he would have results, and then he'd write them down or draw pictures. But one of the interesting one that is always referenced about Crowley is the Alamantra working that happened in New York City while he was in here in the United States working as an asset of British intelligence. That he ended up drawing this creature that looks exactly like a gray alien, which is called a gray alien. So there's a direct and this is 1918. And it's incredible. He called it Lamb, but it's more, that's more of kind of like an honorific title. It goes like llama. It's like the same word as llama is lamb. So so it's really something else. When you look back, and like, his main event in his life was the receipt of the Book of the Law that took place in Egypt in 1904, which is being behind his head, Awas dictated this book that became the centerpiece of his kind of ritual magic setup or something like that. And so that was supposedly another entity that he called like some kind of thing of like a change of world events, almost like that was how important it was to him. So I think that if you have a spiritual worldview, and I mean, it's outside of Crowley, these other people are contacting demons and spirits and stuff like that. So I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that Crowley is talking about demons. You made an interesting point of him ripping off the Bible. Like, his whole thing was to rip off the Bible. So he ripped off Revelation. So he had rituals and terms. The beast, he was the beast. He had a scarlet woman. He had a mark of the beast that he would literally, you can see evidence of the mark of the beast where he would literally brand women like a person brands a cow on their chest of the mark of the beast. So these are things that he's ripping off from Christianity. There's no question, and inverting them. This is classic satanic inversion. So
not to mention, I've read elsewhere. I don't remember seeing it in your book, but his I mean, there were just so many unspeakable things. You often write in your book, like, there's stuff that he wrote I can't publish here. It's so insane. And his communion or Eucharist, I mean, just completely.
The cake of light. Yeah, so it's interesting because Leah Sublime is like his nastiest poem of his other nasty poems, which are rife with all kinds of stuff. Like, I don't even want to mention the book, but it's interesting because you mentioned Dellingpole. In the Dellingpole thing, I mentioned Leah Sublime was like in some kind of ritual that Boris Johnson's current wife or girlfriend was in, and I know the words. They like literally wrote out the words from Leah Sublime. So people who think Crowley is some kind of like ancient dead letter are sorely mistaken. He's very relevant. There's people who believe in his theology or his ideology to this day. I mean, you can go, and I include all that. I have a follow-on book to this one called Children of the Beast, which shows kind of like the cultural impact of Crowley's ideas on 20th century culture and history. It's legion. It's really something else.
And just to go further on that point, because I'm fascinated on by this, to get your thoughts from your reading, extrapolation, this, because I think you said he wanted to get in contact with the devil. So this attempts at personal communication with the devil. How do you think this mechanism of contact between humans and demons or fallen angels and spirits? I may have told this story once before. When I lived in 2006 in the Gobi Desert in the middle of nowhere in my yurt in Mongolia, I had what I believe to have been an attempted demonic possession. And in the secular world, this would be classified as a sleep paralysis. And I recall I'm sleeping. It's freezing cold. I'm in my sleeping bag on my bed in my yurt. There's a bare light bulb that we use for our light, and the switch was right above me. And I wake up like in the middle of the night. I was sleeping like this because it's like -30, and I'm startled awake. And I look at the doors in the yurts are like half the size of a standard door. You have to bow to get to walk in. and I saw, I sensed that there was this black sort of shadowy mass there, and I could sense like it was an entity. And my heart, I'm like, okay, maybe I'm waking up. It's just nothing. I'm like, let me turn on the light, to investigate. And I was awake. I remember I was fully awake, but I was paralyzed. I could not move my hand to turn on the light. And that's when my heart starts racing. I'm like, what is going on? And I don't remember if I was able to speak or I just thought it in my head. I remember from the New Testament that all demons and spirits, angels must obey the authority of Jesus Christ. And that's when I said, in the name of Jesus, because I remember, they would have to, how many times we read, the Legion and the pigs, they have to obey. He's the cop, he's the authority, the military, political authority. And as soon as I said, in the name of Jesus, I could move. I turned on the light. There was nothing there. I walk out my yurt. I walk around the yurt like nothing is going on. And I brushed it because this was like 2016 and I was still early on in my learning about all of these things. I brushed it off until about a year later, I stumbled upon a website talking about possession and sleep paralysis, and testimony after testimony after testimony explained the same thing. And I'm like, what I think happened, the demon was trying to enter me. And I was like, saying the name of Jesus disappeared. And so last minute, but just your thought. And then I had a friend in Mongolia, in Switzerland, a good friend, and she was into the occult. And she, she said, yeah, like this stuff happens. I mean, she was into the occult, we're good friends. And I think she's still in Switzerland. And she says, her and her friends would like go to the astral plane. And I think all this stuff is possible. And because Mongolia is 90% Buddhist or shaman, especially I think the way the yurts are constructed, they have a lot of imagery of this, we can say demonic stuff, which could then attract these spirits. And so, and then we have these people like you detail in your book, they're doing these things to try, to commune with these spirits. And so how do you think that functions, this mechanism of trying to get into touch with spirits?
Well, that's a good question. I don't really delve that much into Crowley's kind of ritual practices or his magic. Like I try to take an objective, overarching view. As somebody who doesn't practice, I've been accused of being a Satanist. I've never practiced Satanism. I'm part of this fallen culture. There's absolutely no question about that, but I've never practiced Satanism. I'm curious about it. I've read a lot about it. I've read a lot about a lot of different things. But they definitely do, and I think that a lot of these people, they want to be possessed, believe it or not. Whether I've studied Damien Eccles of the West Memphis 3, they think it gives them power. And they do these rituals to try to maximize that power. So all of the elements of like ceremonial magic are very important. And I think that that's like, you see Crowley's, there's a picture in my book of Crowley in his Golden Dawn attire. And I think all those things are trying to maximize the energies, the magical energies, the aether or whatever, to maximize them within the magician to effectuate change in conformance with will. So I think that part of these, like that's part of it, is trying to get that energy, but also to communicate with spirits to give them all those things that he wants: power, knowledge, things that that they want, money, sex, all that stuff. So I think that there are means by which he's supposed to do that. I know Crowley thought he astrally traveled. He thought he could communicate with people on other parts of the world. And you can see other people who are also ceremonial magicians. They also practice this. One of the practitioners of ceremonial magic, believe it or not, was David Bowie. And there's pictures of him doing a lot of these kind of really intense astral projection things. And when you go out, the symbol of the astral projection, when you go out, you're supposed to have a string that pulls you back in. And there's a picture during Bowie's kind of Crowley phase, where he was into Crowley and the Kabbalah. You'll see him a picture in these specific magical stances with the silver string wrapped around whatever he was wearing, kind of almost like a jogging outfit. But so I think that they have these kind of devices and things that they use, these necromancers or sorcerers like Crowley, to contact evil spirits. No question.
I mean, for people, who are not Christian, I mean, this stuff is real. You've interviewed, I've interviewed occultists, and I think there is this supernatural activity and power there. And obviously the Bible says, do not go there. Do not try to do that stuff.
Never suffer a witch to live, I think, is the Old Testament. The New Testament, they're contesting with Simon Magus. That's what Crowley thought of himself, as a magus as well. So I think that this kind of strain of conflict between obedience to God and doing, the law, not engaging in necromancy, and then people who do and are fallen or cursed or bad outcomes, whether it's like Saul going to the Witch of Endor, or there's just so many other stories and things like that. People seeking knowledge and things like that. It's just, and then you mentioned, like, all the way in Mongolia, they're talking about evil spirits. Almost every society, I don't know a society who doesn't believe that there are evil spirits. Like, they believe that there's dark entities. They believe that their ancestors may be present or something. They might have contact with them, and also that there's a good God, but different names, maybe not exactly as we know him through Christ or through the Old Testament, but some kind of creative force or the Great Spirit or something like that. Like, it's somewhere in all these cultures, almost all have that kind of outlook.
Yeah, and my simple explanation for the ancestor thing, I think that's just a fraud. That it's, again, these spirits have been around for thousands of years, since the beginning, and they know about. They've been around. They were alive when your ancestors were around, and so they know that history to pretend being your ancestor. That's my opinion. But you mentioned the Kabbalah, I think, more in passing in your book, and I just realized 10 years ago, one of my Mexican coworkers. He was a Kabbalist. He would always say, I'm a Kabbalist. And I actually don't know as much as I should about Kabbalah. One of these days I got to do a crash course on Kabbalah, but just if you could just tell us, what that is and how that fits into what Crowley's doing. And I think what the elite are doing today, I think Kabbalah is also very much present. No?
I think so. I think Kabbalah, the allegation, my understanding is this book of kind of, black magic or esotericism came by Jews through kind of medieval Spain, and then kind of bounced around, and the Jews kind of got the blame for it, but apparently it goes back to Mesopotamia, much like Baphomet or things like that, which was brought over by the Templars and things like that. So I think that it kind of got this Jewish kind of stamp on it, which it is. There Jews do like the Kabbalah. There's a Kabbalah Center in Los Angeles. It's that red string, but it contains a lot of different wisdom and has different ideas. For Crowley, I think some of the main stuff were subsets within Kabbalah, where his kind of magical worldview of correspondences and stuff, what he would do is, like, words would have numerical value and things like that. So he would always there's so many scribbles of Crowley, like taking apart words and finding their numerical value in English or Greek or things like that. So he would do that, these kind of things. Also, the tree of life, the Sephiroth and things like that. That's another aspect of the secret knowledge and this idea of different spheres and dimensions underneath those spheres. So I think he kind of used that as well. But, like, if you see Crowley's in weird numerology, and this goes up to 9/11, like, he would take these words, but two of his important words were Greek words, agape and thelema. And he found that basically they're English numerical. If these letters have a numeric meaning, their numeric value added up to 93. So that would be kind of like a way for him to express his concepts, is through these numbers. So the numbers, not as numerology, have meaning as numbers, but they reference meaning, if that makes sense. So 93 represents agape and thelema. So he would have his famous statement, love under law, love under will. So it would be symbolized by this numbers 93. He would actually sign his documents. Same with Jimmy Page, 93, 93, 93. And that's why I think that 93 is in the events of 9/11, Flight 93. I don't think it's a mistake.
Yeah, and I want to get to that later. That was insane. And then, okay, after Kabbalah, just real quick, he attempts to rise through the ranks of these secret occult orders, right? The Order of the Golden Dawn. He tries to take control of it. It's just absolute madman. And I think he does some magic and, like, voodoo stuff. He creates wax figures to put curses and create confusion and disorder. I think ultimately I think later he much later on he's involved in the court case suing the folks there, and I think they ultimately they all fall apart. And so, what's important with the Golden Dawn?
Well, it's a post-Masonic order, so that means they've already gone through Masonry. And it was at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century. I think it had some famous members, but it was ceremonial magic. So, like, the sword and the orb and the wand and all these things are important to, and they still have like very intense rituals that you can go buy a book about the magic of the Golden Dawn. I think there's kind of a legacy group that's around, but it was an important stepping point for Crowley because he met people within the Golden Dawn. He had read a book, I think it was called Shadow on the Clouds. I forgot the name of it, but it led him to the Golden Dawn, and he met this guy MacGregor Mathers, who he looked at as kind of his new kind of guru, kind of somebody who led him. Mathers would wear strange clothing, magical clothing, and so Crowley adopted this. You'll see pictures of him in clothes you wouldn't understand or different outfits, but he picked up on this kind of like these traits of MacGregor Mathers. It wasn't his real name, but like you said, Crowley went through the Golden Dawn. He wanted to go up. He had a bad reputation. He had a famous battle with William Butler Yeats on a staircase, and there's different stories about what really happened. I tend to believe Yeats more than I do Crowley, but he went through the thing, wanted to get raised up to the second level in the Golden Dawn. They wouldn't let him in. He kind of weaseled his way around, and then the Golden Dawn blew up, and Crowley was formerly saying he would take an oath of secrecy to not divulge the information in the Golden Dawn. Divulged it. There was a lawsuit. There was a judge. These are historical records. A judge saying this is like the strangest trial I've ever seen in my life. And I forgot what the outcome was. I think he just dismissed
it. Was in favor of Crowley, so they let him publish it,
okay. And so these are like public things, but it just shows Crowley not being a very honest participant in these matters. But this was kind of a stepping stone of his kind of hierarchy, his rise through kind of the occult ranks, if you will, where he's absorbing more and more information from a wide variety of sources. But I think the Golden Dawn was really one of the more important ones. And he kind of kept a lot of that information. And some of his followers actually ended up like in Sedona, Arizona, a guy who followed Crowley and, published stuff about the Golden Dawn. So you can still read about it.
Yeah, and there, what I got also from reading your book was there just seemed to be a hodgepodge, and just people inventing, making up orders, and secret societies, which a bit strange. He comes down here to Mexico City, becomes a 33-degree Mason. Yeah,
no, it's crazy. And when he was at Cambridge, he said he had three main interests: poetry, mountain climbing, and magic. And so he kind of overlapped his writings of poetry, which never really became a popular aspect of Crowley, considering his output. But he was always traveling around, like ascending mountains. So Switzerland, present-day Nepal, India, Pakistan, Mexico, like you said. I can't remember the two things he ascended there. But like in his kind of earlier, healthier days, that was kind of like what he would do, considering he never really had a 9-to-5 job. So he's always just getting money from his parents or whatever to do whatever he wanted to do, and living the life of like a aristocrat, like a dandy too. I think he was kind of like, you consider him a dandy at the end of the 19th century. Like imagine some guy with like, floral shirts or white shirts or something out of like Interview with a Vampire or something like that. Like, I think that's kind of the way he lived.
Yeah, and what you describe in his book, I mean, because he's got this money, so he's doing occultism full time, traveling the planet, getting with men and women and who knows what else, just discarding, marrying, having children, has complete disdain for his children and people. He dons these costumes and creates these fictitious sort of personas, just absolutely wild. And you mentioned secret chiefs, and this is fast forwarding a bit to his influence beyond the grave. But I first learned this term, secret chiefs. I used to listen to stuff like Faith No More, right? Mike Patton, and I remember this was when Faith No More was broken up. This is probably 25 years ago in a small theater in my hometown of Chicago, I saw Mike Patton perform with one of his side groups. I think it was a guy from the Melvins. I can't remember the name of that band. Funky stuff. And I entered the it was a small theater. Mike Patton standing right there. I'm like walking by him, and I'm like, I don't know what I would say to Mike Patton. But one of the groups that he was interacting with is called Secret Chiefs 3. I don't know if you've heard this band. I've got some of their music, Secret Chiefs 3. And apparently, you look at the song titles, it's called like Book of the Law. It's all this stuff straight out of Crowley. And they mix Eastern music with rock. And, at first go, it's kind of like, it's interesting, this music. But then I realized, oh boy, these guys, Trace Bruins, I think, formed Secret Chiefs 3. But what are the Secret Chiefs?
It comes out of like Blavatsky. It's these kind of hidden masters. Very much back in the day, like Tibet had this kind of, even through kind of Nazism, the kind of New Age elements of Nazism, this kind of like, there's some kind of hidden Shambhala, and the secret chiefs are informing. They're kind of like these kind of like people providing knowledge. So people were trying to contact these secret chiefs. And I think that's kind of like Blavatsky through Bailey, through that whole thing. Lucis Trust is one of the, Leadbeater was another guy whose name comes to mind. But yeah, all believed in all the way to the present. I mean, and kind of like one of the disturbing, people think this is kind of old news, but according to some researchers, early David Icke had this one of the secret chiefs, who's Rikorsky, which he referenced. He doesn't do it anymore, which is interesting. But that puts him kind of right into the kind of New Age mind, unchristian, by the way. The New Age is not Christian. Crowley would have called it the Age of Horus or something like that. He was a New Ager. But so these Rikorsky, I can't remember. Saint Germain was one. There's all these, and there were people would try, these kind of New Ager types would try to find communication. There was Dawaj Khul, I think, was the one who inspired Bailey, also in California. Like California was like the epicenter of New Age, and a lot of ex-Crowley people were all over California, whether it was Parsons, Hubbard, Huxley of all people, believe it or not, who knew. It's established that Huxley had met Crowley in the 30s and had written about him, and may have gotten magic mushrooms. I think they had a different name for it back then. Anhelonium was the name. It was kind of so-called scientific name. But yeah, the secret chiefs, just to summarize, are these kind of ascended masters, is what they said, who are giving information to humanity.
I do have a question towards the end, referring to the New Age alt media. But Dr. Mercola, apparently, last year it was reported he's now taking instructions from Balun, some demonic entity, and so just like you go down the line, Mercola, Ike, you name it.
I didn't know that.
Poems to so again, he writes these poems to Lucifer, Satan, and explicitly one of his goals was to get people away from Jesus, to destroy Christianity. You talk about Crowleyanity. He was effectively an antichrist. He wanted to be Antichrist. He wanted to be Christ. That's what the term refers to, someone in the place of Christ, to be God. And so, I've mentioned this before. Again, you go to the people after he died, the influences, Jazz Coleman of Killing Joke.
Right.
I've seen them perform once.
I've heard you talk about him.
I almost got about the podcast during COVID, but he gave an interview, Coleman, where he said, that he's the Theosophist. He was involved with Tavistock, and that his goal is to eradicate Christianity. And so, just your further thoughts on Crowley.
Do you know much about Coleman's parent or where he's from? Because he has a very successful brother, I think, is a professor too. But if his dad, if it's the right Coleman, I can't figure it out. His dad may be a member of the Pilgrim Society.
Wouldn't that be funny if his dad was John Coleman? I'm just kidding.
Well, that would be funnier, more strange. But I think he's kind of half what they call Asian in the UK or whatever. But I think he is very suspicious. Like, he doesn't know. You don't find much about his parents, because I tried to find that out. But yeah, Killing Joke is fully, they're magicians and they do all kinds of magic stuff. But Crowley's influence, kind of after he died in 47, is like all over the place through the culture. Timothy Leary thought he was carrying on Crowley's work. So he's actually said that in public statements.
Also, Hubbard, no, because I've seen Good Fight Ministries. They've done hours and hours of documentaries, and they use primary sources. They talk about Crowley, and they say Crowley wanted to bring about the end of the world, the end times. He wanted to be the beast of Revelation and Antichrist. And then Good Fight Ministries also explains how after he passes, that Hubbard, of Scientology, they want to try to do the same thing. And I don't know about, Leary also.
The timing's interesting because Crowley dies in 47 and then Dianetics is 48 and then 1950 Scientology. And Hubbard's pretty much well established. Like there's video, like I sent it to somebody recently who requested it. There's audio of Hubbard talking about Crowley. He knew Crowley. And according to his son, Hubbard's son, at the very inception of Dianetics and Scientology, Hubbard would have all of Crowley's materials and do black magic and read all the stuff and thought it was like his way to power. And the establishment between Hubbard and Parsons, who Crowley said Parsons was his most important follower in the world, who was in Pasadena. The establishment of Parsons and Hubbard is a historical record. And they did what's called the Babylon working, which is another carrying on Crowley's working, where they would drive out from Pasadena. They would go east to the Mojave Desert out in like kind of really the wilderness and do rituals. And apparently they took like John Dee's kind of communication board where he would talk what he would call, angelic or what did they call it? There was a word for it, but they would try to break through different planes of thought. But yeah, so Crowley and him, and that's kind of an the whole idea of the Babylon working was to kind of bring the feminine version of Satan on the earth. Her name was Lady Babylon, and to kind of incarnate a new magical era. So these guys had pretty ambitious ideas, Parsons and Hubbard. But Hubbard, there's no question, Scientology's rife with a lot of mind control and Crowleyism, but at least the ethos of Crowley. And Hubbard was a real monster. Like I included Children of the Beast, some of the rituals he did, which are unspeakable, but it's important to know. It's called soul cracking, which, you don't really want to know about. Leary, so influential, knew Huxley right at the end. So there's a tie between Crowley to Huxley to Leary, who carried on this LSD. So Crowley, like one of his things of bringing into our current civilization was sex and drugs. So Crowley's like experimenting with drugs his whole life. Cocaine. I mean, it's really almost like unbelievable amounts. Heroin, cocaine, mushrooms, alcohol, ether, E-T-H-E-R. So like they would breathe in ether and go to other places, and nicotine, just everything that you wouldn't believe. But Leary then is the Johnny Appleseed of LSD. But one of the interesting things about Leary is he was at one of these places where Crowley did a ritual in Algeria, and it was at a oasis called Bou Sada. And Crowley was there with one of his hapless followers named Victor Newberg. It was never this. When people met Crowley, when he was done with them, they were never the same. They were all like nervous wrecks or committed suicide or descended into alcoholism. But this guy Victor Newberg was in Bou Sada, and then Leary, when he left the United States, ends up in Algeria at this Bou Sada and says, "Wow, the overlaps and the synchronicities between our lives are undeniable." So he really, this is a very much of a person on this kind of counterculture, which Crowley would have been seen in the countercultural as well. Countercultural figure who's really a top figure in American history is like a Crowley follower. A lot of people missed out or don't see that connection. And I go into long chapters about him and his connection to Robert Anton Wilson, which is the Illuminatus trilogy. And then you can go Jimmy Page, total Crowley follower. Ozzy Osbourne knows about Crowley and does some interesting. He knows a lot about black magic, and it just goes on and on. Like the Doors. There's supposedly a connection between Morrison. Some people have disputed it. There's a bust of Morrison on a statuary of Crowley. Another guy that's really important is Kenneth Anger, who is definitely all in weird places all over American history, who died fairly recently, but he used to live with a guy who was a part of the Manson family. is Bobby Bouzoulet lived with Anger, and like they did weird rituals together. So you see this black magic connection between him. And apparently when Anger knew Mark Chapman before Chapman supposedly shot John Lennon. And that's another weird connection. So there's like the 20th century history has an occultist would call it a current, but I would call it an undercurrent, maybe even an overcurrent of these people who believe in the New Age and occultism, and Crowley influencing the culture in very profound ways. It's not even up till 9/11. It's not arguable.
Yeah, and I had this question for later on, but you brought it up, and as you say, it's continuing. It's not going away. It seems to be growing, and a lot of these people are initiates, disciples of all this stuff. And you already mentioned some of the big names, but I when I was younger, I just tried to absorb very much into culture, music, like I said, Killing Joke, all this stuff. And so you can identify it's much profounder than most people think. Most people will stop at Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin, and Black Sabbath, Mr. Crowley. But it's everywhere. I had already mentioned Killing Joke, and Jimmy Page apparently bought Crowley's house, I think, on Lake Loch Ness. And I didn't want to ask you. Then there was you mentioned Love Under Will. I was a huge fan of the Canadian rock band The Tea Party, Jeff Martin, and I didn't know it at the time, but in some of his famous songs, I don't know if it was Heaven. There's a song with the Heaven in the title, forgetting it now, but he sings the chorus is Love Under Will, and so Jeff Martin is intentionally inserting Crowley in his lore and his lyrics, and then I found out later in the recent couple of years, because he lives between Australia and Canada, Jeff Martin, he organized events, specifically like Crowley events. One of his solo albums is 777. So the guy just soaked in this stuff. And then there's Jay-Z, people know the t-shirt he wore of Do What Thou Wilt. And then Bruce Dickinson of Iron Maiden. I've been fascinated for a time with Iron Maiden, and just the persona of Bruce Dickinson. I've got his autobiography, the fact that he's a Renaissance man. I saw them perform, I think, in Split, Croatia in 2008, Iron Maiden. And you reference it in Delingpole, Bruce Dickinson's got Crowley throughout his lyrics and this occult stuff. And he even financed, I think, and produced this film, which I saw, which you mentioned, of Crowley. So it's like, why is Bruce Dickinson so obsessed with Crowley? Just thoughts on that?
It's a good question. I think that Crowley's promise to people was to kind of like, you could have whatever you want, do what your will, but you could have like, do all the drugs and sex that you wanted. So I think that what he was selling to the general public, for certain people, whether we want to be a rock star, film star, that was something that attracted people. So I think Dickinson, that was it. According to I think it was like the British historians, Crowley's one of the top 100 people ever born in the UK. So he just, goes through the Beatles. There's just so many other people. But Dickinson's an interesting one, and that movie had a lot of flaws, but the portrayal of Crowley when he was in Hastings at his old age by an actor who I'd never remember his name. It's easy to remember. Shrapnel, right? So like that when a bomb explodes, it has shrapnel. Anyway, he does a great job of portraying Crowley in his addled, drugged out age. He gets angry. He gets a check. He gets an envelope and there's no check in there. And he gets all angry and gets frustrated. But he has all his books. He's coveting his books. But if people get a chance to see that movie, there are certain parts that ring true. They ring true with the Crowleyan tradition. I think there's some darker things. I think that the title in England is different than the one in the U.S. The U.S. title's Crowley, but Number of the Beast, Children of the Beast. I think he has a song, Children or Number of the Beast,
and there's Children of the Damned. There's all kinds of.
I think there's a lot of different things. They have influenced by the occult. I think they had one about some Egyptology or things like that. I have to go back and relook at his stuff, but it just shows Crowley. And Alan Moore is another person. So many of the things that he's written are influenced by Crowley, or literally have Crowley as a child in them, whether it's From Hell or The Watchmen, or there's quotes from Crowley in, what's the one with the famous mask, is the V for Vendetta, has direct quotes of Crowley in it. So he actually, Alan Moore interestingly said he spends half of his time writing comic books or whatever they call them, picture novels, and half the other time doing ceremonial magic. And he has a god he calls Glykon, who is some weird snake god that he worships. And these guys have like weird things like that. Like they believe in these entities. And Alan Moore's there's really interesting documentaries about that guy. But I mean, that suffused the whole culture. Watchmen.
This is no joke. I mean, like, people have no idea. Like, when my younger self, it's like you just consume what's out there, what's in your face. You flip on the TV, there's the music. You go on the YouTube and the magazines. Yeah, I collected comics for a brief time when I was a kid, and like it's everywhere you look. You just mentioned. And then again, Good Fight Ministries, they've done hours upon hours of documentaries on the Marvel universe. And they use primary source stuff, so it's undeniable. And they show, like Iron Man in one of the actual comic books, it says he was conceived. He's the son of the devil, or that the half. Wow. Like, and so like all these figures. If you look in comic lore now, they try to take the bad guy and make him the superhero. Like Venom. Or it's like Batman is like this dark figure, and it's always them trying to get you to like. It's like, I think they're trying to get you to like Lucifer. So the evil, the Satan, is this inversion again, and try to get you to not like, the actual good person, God and Jesus. But Marvel, Good Fight Ministries covers that in their documentaries. Like, it just goes throughout all of the Marvel universe. In that documentary, Doctor Strange. I'm not, I haven't. It's apparently popular, right? This TV show, is it Doctor Strange or whatever?
There's been a couple movies, yeah.
Right. They point out that apparently the influence for the figure of Doctor Strange is, guess who? Aleister Crowley.
Wow. See, I didn't know.
It's just like you can trace that. I'm like, it's insane. And so, but I guess moving forward, I was shocked. I think you mentioned in your book, at one point, Chesterton praised Crowley's poetry.
He sure did. He sure did. So it was kind of an interesting connection. One of the things, like with my take in the book too, was to try to find as many people who actually met Crowley, so they could have firsthand communication or impact, influence what they thought of him at any given time. And Chesterton was one of them. At least read it. But Hemingway saw him. There's other guys that saw Crowley who were famous. There's like a famous Portuguese writer who was with Crowley, but certain people saw him at different times. You mentioned that one quote about Christianity and Crowleyanity. That was Clifford Bax, who kind of has lost to history. But he met Crowley, and Crowley said to him, "I'm going to destroy Christianity, and one day we'll see the rise of Crowleyanity," or something. So he was saying that at a very early age. But yeah. So a lot of these people have seen like Crowley around. It's another one is Somerset Maugham, who wrote a book that was based on Crowley. It was called The Magician. There's actually a movie about it too. So you can see, and Crowley's writing a lot in Vanity Fair. So he's H.L. Mencken. Some of these other guys, like there's just so many people that famous journalists, some people that people know. Like if you're from the New UK, Tom Dryburgh. And he was involved with so many scandals in the UK, but Tom Dryburgh was Crowley's heir. And like, he was literally the equivalent in the US of being the head of the Democratic Party. He was the head of the Labor Party. So they literally had a political figure who was Crowley's heir. When Crowley died, he made some random kid, his executor, his name was Simons, who wrote a book about him. But when he died, Dryburgh came and drove to Crowley's place in Hastings and rifled through his papers and took a piece of paper out of there and left. And apparently that piece of paper was the oath that Dryburgh made to Crowley to like follow Crowley's kind of religious system. But yeah, I mean, it's all hidden. It's all kind of underground. There's so many like heads of like intelligence knew Crowley, other writers, Fleming, who wrote James Bond. Just goes on and on.
That was my next question. I got that book. I'm sure you're familiar with it. I've had it like for a decade. I haven't read it yet. It's an academic book, or it has a very academic approach about British intelligence and Crowley. And you mentioned it in your book.
Is it Secret Agent 666?
Yeah, I think that's the one.
Yeah.
And
by Spence. Yeah.
How important do you think was Crowley's involvement with British intelligence? Because I think one thing people do have to realize, just because someone is affiliated with whatever intelligence agency in their history, it could be a very minor role. Obviously, it could be a very huge role, but how would you sort of estimate what was Crowley doing as a British intelligence asset?
I think he was an intel asset, although picked up from college all the way to his death, like all the way up. And there's communication between, like, he's sending stuff to Ian Fleming about, like, I can help you out. But I think that he was always moving in strange ways. Literally kicked out of Italy by Mussolini personally. But in the U.S., I mean, this Spence book, Dr. Spence found records from the U.S. that said Crowley's here, and we know he's an intel agent. So it's like admitted he's doing weird things in New York. He has in the New York Times. There's actually an article about Crowley, and it says Irish patriot renounces British citizen, and Crowley had these like ridiculous publicity stunts he would do all the time. This was one of them. So he had one of his Scarlet Women on a boat with him playing violin, and he went out into the Hudson River or whatever in front of the Statue of Liberty and ripped up of either a fake or a real British passport, and it made the news. And that was part of his cover. And so, but he admits in his autobiography called Confessions, which he confesses to a lot. And there's a lot of names of like intel people in there too. He confesses that he's basically there to subvert the Germans. The Germans were always trying to outdo the British in influence in the U.S. And so he saw himself as an agent, which I think he was. I think he was telling the truth. Actually, one interesting story is he came to the U.S. on the Lusitania, and that was kind of what was the final straw, which brought the U.S. into the war decisively. And he worked for there's another interesting fact about Crowley. He worked for two magazines that were run by a sympathetic German guy or German American. One was called The International, and the other one was called The Fatherland. And there's other famous writers that he's writing. He writes under his own name, and then his fake Magick name. I think one was Frater Perdurabo. It's kind of hard to tell because he writes all the time. He really was a literateur, but used different pen names. But the other person, there's an article that I show, I think in my documentary, in one of the things of The Fatherland, he's literally writing an article in the same magazine as Arthur Schnitzler, and if you know who that is, or Schnitzler is, that is the author of Traum Novelle, which was the basis for Eyes Wide Shut. Like, you can't write that. Like, that's really true. Like, it's on. I'll try to post it on my social media. But like, there's weird connections like Crowley to these people they're legion. They're all over the place.
And so you mentioned, one of my questions was he becomes persona non grata everywhere. I mean, England, Italy,
kicked out of France, is in Germany during the Weimar Republic, leading up to Hitler's ascent, and then leaves suspiciously once Hitler comes to power. Like, why are you there right at this kind of very chaotic time in German history that really is a world event? Crowley infamously said in Time magazine after the war, this is a play on Christianity if you know your Bible or your New Testament. He said, before Hitler was, I am. So he's actually kind of comparing himself. There's overlaps, and nobody's done the research, at least in the West, at least in English. There's some in German. Overlaps between OTO, which really was a German secret society that Crowley became the head of in 1925. Stands for Ordo Templi Orientis. It's also an ideogram. Crowley believed in ideograms. Maybe you can figure out what the ideogram is of. But he was very much connected to German life and German intelligence. They had come to visit him and made him the head of the OTO, I think in like 1911 or something, before he came to the U.S., because they thought he was ripping them off. They thought he was ripping off their secret information, but they had kind of come to the conclusions at the same time to kind of change their rituals, is a really polite way to say it.
Yeah, it almost sounds like he could have been part of the bringing about Hitler. And again, for the few listeners that listen to this podcast, and I see comments. I got an email today that was very uncouth, referring to the Jews. And Mark Passio, I always reference him. He gave a 4-hour lecture. Look, I mean, you can say whatever one likes about Zionism and that sort of stuff, but to then openly, we're seeing this resurgence and promotion of Hitler as a good guy and National Socialism, and he's just trying to defend the nation. And it's like, no, like Mark Passio spends 4 hours explaining how he was an occult creation, Hitler and the Nazis. I think it was in your book you mentioned Crowley. There was something about a swastika, like hairs on his chest or something. I can't recall that were in or maybe he wrote about it.
Oh, right, yeah, no. He said he was born with something special on his thing that were in the shape of a swastika. So he like deified his own birth. Crowley did. Yeah, it's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, but again, like the Nazi regime and Hitler were not some good guys. They were, in my mind, they were artificial creation of all this occult globalist stuff, and were going to be used. And I believe he had aspirations for, it's clear, for world domination. So I'm just really annoyed with you sympathizers of Nazism, right? And so out there, I keep saying my grandpa was a prisoner of the Nazis. They openly say, I am an Untermensch. I'm a Slav. Well, how could I have sympathy for Nazism, who would just use me as cattle, slavery? But anyways,
it's important that you mention Hitler because he kept this kind of Luciferian tradition. Aryanism comes out, this concept of different racial groups and a hierarchy of racial groups comes out of Blavatsky. It's Blavatsky's work, guys. Aryanism, he used to have the secret doctrine apparently on the side of his bed. Crowley was, Hitler was an occultist. It's proven. I pretty much proved that. We got part of his library. He had this book called, that was very much like Crowley's Magick in Theory and Practice. But he had it and he underlined all these like occult phrases. This is not a Christian guy. Hitler said in 1929, I am a pagan to the bone. And all of that stuff that the Nazis went through is like paganism, blood and soil. These are all pagan principles, guys. These are not Christian. So he was not a good guy and destroyed Germany. He destroyed his own country. He destroyed other countries too, but like the end part of Hitler was just a disaster. And the similarities in philosophy, if you want to talk a philosophy of Lucifer that is subscribed to by Crowley and Hitler, there's a lot of overlaps. Triumph of the will, right? We went through this whole notion of a god, Thelema is the translation to will. So Crowley's religion is called Thelema. It's called will. And then you have a guy in 33 or whatever puts out Triumph of the Will with, can't remember the director of it, but like it's him coming out, Crowley's coming out of the sky like a god. And so and one of the interesting bios of Hitler is called the psychopathic god. And Crowley thought of himself as a god. You mentioned the swastika. Here's the quote of Crowley. This is him talking about himself. He wore on his body the three most important distinguishing marks of a Buddha. He was tongue-tied, and on the second day of his incarnation, a surgeon cut the frenum linguae. He also had the characteristic membrane, which necessitated an operation for phimosis some 3 lustres later. Lastly, he had upon the center of his heart 4 hairs curling from left to right in the exact form of a swastika. Crowley had a very elevated sense of himself. He also wrote in Liber 77, there is no God but man, but he put himself in the same kind of world as Jesus, Buddha, Confucius, like all the great, greatest world teachers or philosophical leaders. So, but yeah, the thing is the swastika thing in Hitler. I'd actually talk more. I have a whole chapter on Hitler in Children of the Beast and how similar he is in outlook and philosophy as Crowley. So when Crowley says, before Hitler was I am, it takes one to know one, Like Crowley had an admiration for Joseph Smith, another ceremonial magician. So he understood, like people here, maybe in the States, maybe look at Joseph Smith as a pure Christian, but Crowley's like, this guy's doing. Crowley did the same kind of ritual magic techniques as Joseph Smith. He would take a seer stone and stick it in a hat and put it over his face and talk to the guy who would write stuff down. Like, so Dee and Kelly, Joseph Smith had a guy named Sidney Rignan, and then Crowley and Victor Newberg. And you can go to like museums there's like tons of these seer stones that Joseph Smith had, but this in museums in Utah. You can just look it up online. Joseph Smith seer stone. So Crowley understood, like, I think he made like Joseph Smith either a member of the Gnostic Mass or something like that. But he knew what Joseph Smith was up to.
Yeah, for people don't know, that's the guy who founded Mormonism, which if you examine has little to do with Christianity. And some people might get triggered by that, but whatever. And it was clear that Hitler was an Antichrist figure. So again, there's nothing redeeming about him. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer gets hanged by the Nazis, and so it was clear that he hijacked the false churches, and then the true Christianity struggled against the
Nazism from the very beginning was anti-Christian. They were going to ban the Christian church. This almost every reputable Nazi or German scholar knows that at a certain point they were going to either subvert or ban Christianity in Germany. There's no question about it. And I actually have quotes of that in Children of the Beast. So people who say it's like when they think that these Nazis are Christians, they're just trying to besmirch, in my opinion, besmirch Christianity and stain it by saying he was a Christian. But in action, he was probably the complete opposite of a Christian, like Hitler.
I'd argue he was a globalist. He was trying to bring about globalism. He was used by the globalists, and today, folks are trying to paint him as the opposite. No, he tried to defeat the globalists. No, I'm sorry. And I guess towards the end of his life, there's talk of sacrifice of animals. I think you mentioned he regularly sacrificed goats, and there's talk about humans as well. I would probably believe that he probably at some point sacrificed humans. You talked about he had a human skull in his apartment, which he would feed animals and blood. And I just want to read something you wrote towards the end of his life, or it was a quote. It says, "The truly awful thing about Crowley is that one suspects he didn't really believe in anything, even his wickedness. Perhaps the only thing that wasn't fake was his addiction to heroin and cocaine. He said there is no God but man." And then further it says, "He seemed to be, at the end of his life, to be disintegrating and to be surrounded by an aura of physical corruption. He had thick eyeglasses, a perpetual tear in the corner of one eye, and a flattish yellow face. Altogether, he was more repulsive than I had expected. His voice was the ugliest thing about him: thin, fretful, scratchy, a pedantic voice in a pretentious manner." And I forget the last thing that was recorded that he said, "I am perplexed," he said. And so very wretched. So your thoughts on his end, and whether he possibly sacrificed even humans?
I have an article that I posted recently online that's kind of pulling certain things out of his work, and it's called Aleister Crowley and Human Sacrifice. And it's all the references in there. So a lot of the Crowley advocates will just reference this one statement from Magick in Theory and Practice and say he was using it symbolically. Well, you don't have to worry about that, because you can go to Liber 66, you can go to The World's Tragedy, you can go to these other places where Crowley's literally talking about infant sacrifice and depicting it. And so Liber 66 is a good start, and go to The World's Tragedy is Jesus Christ, and the whole narrative starts out with a child sacrifice, and it ends up with a really horrible depiction of Jesus in the worst possible way being overcome by Crowley in the guise of Alexandra. So he takes Christ's place. It's really dark. He also did the Cross of the Frog too, where you're supposed to, one of the rituals is you're supposed to mock the death and resurrection of Christ by tying a frog to a cross and killing it. I have that in the book too. So it gets really dark. But I think human sacrifice, there were rumors of that happening at his magical fraternity called the Abbey of Thelema, right? Abbey of the Will again, 1920 to 23 in Cefalù in Italy. And so they kind of surrounded him. There's weird pictures of Crowley drawing people that he, made pass out. And there's just weird stories about him. I talked about the cat, but we know that he it gets graphic. He killed a goat in a ritual. That's pretty much attested to by witnesses. And those are just some things. Blood drawing. You talked about the cakes of light. But the real evidence for human sacrifice isn't great. The evidence for him being a pedophile is really good, because he wrote about it in in the Magical Record of the Beast 666. So his own diaries, which he carefully didn't want people to read because they were all for his thing, where he compares himself to a god, also includes the sexual abuse of his Scarlet Woman at the time, Leah Hersig's 2 or 3-year-old daughter. Really hard. Like, this is a person people, admire. It's crazy. Like a lot of this stuff wasn't known, and a lot of it's covered up. And a lot of the rituals that he wrote, like I mentioned, Liber 66, he organized a lot of his rituals into numerical things. So Liber means book in Latin. They're symbolic, and it's hard to understand what he's really saying. But they're all tinged with really dark magic and dark stuff that I don't want to get into. But one of the interesting musical references, this band Ministry, they know Crowley too, but they understood some of what he was saying symbolically, and I don't want to get into it, but some of they know Crowley, and they mention his book. I can't remember the name of it, but it has magical rituals in it, and yeah, they're dark. Ministry is very dark. They have a good take. They have a really good take on George W. Bush, which is called Rio Grande Blood, which actually was up for a Grammy of all things. It did make it into the public consciousness, but it's really, really good.
Bush is coming up in my questions, but I mean, for me, my takeaway is Crowley is just wretched, nasty. I mean, pathetic. It's just
he was a physical coward. He let people die. I mean, at the end of his life, he was living off of. He had expended what some people estimated at the time when his mother died. He had 20 million pounds. It's an incredible pile of cash. It's like Smaug's in The Hobbit's huge pile of money, and he just blew it. He never had to work in his day, and so that mindset. That's his mindset. So he was living off of other people's money and checks and things like that, and desiccated and still hated Christianity. I include in Children of the Beast this kind of meeting that Crowley had some carolers, Christian carolers, come to his retirement home, and another guy who became kind of one of his followers saw this and wrote about it, where Crowley's screaming at him, "Get out of here!" So he hated Christianity all the way to the very end. I don't think there's any question about it.
Moving beyond Crowley now, towards the end of your book, you talk about Crowley as the primary spiritual and ideological antecedent leading to the events of 9/11. So this is the other part of your title, 9/11 in the New World Order. And you talk about numerology. So 11, 93, 77, 175. And as I'm reading that chapter in your book, what comes to my mind, and this is before I even read subsequently what you wrote. So before I read the next section, I immediately think of false flag operations, 9/11, flight 11, 93, 175 on 9/11, 3/11, 2004, the Madrid, not the band 311, but the Madrid false flag. I believe these were all false flags. The London 7/7, 2005 false flag. And then you write, right after that, you say, clearly the individuals who carried out the false flag terrorist attacks against the U.S. possessed a deep understanding of Crowley's doctrine and system. All of the prime numbers of his works were inserted into the event as numbers on each plane, 11, 77, 93, 175. The presence of these specific numbers on the day of the event indicates that individuals throughout the world familiar with Crowley's works knew the counterfeit nature of the events by a demonic code. The numbers labeled on each plane, and I didn't take it out of the notes, but you subsequently go on to mention Madrid and London and Mumbai and other events. And so what's going on here?
It looks like whoever planned and carried out these events did it on specific dates for a reason. That would my take. I had a kind of separate kind of paper called the Occult Guide to False Flag Terror or something like that I wrote. This is like 15 years ago. But all these dates go back, and the Crowley's prime number is 11. He got it from the Golden Dawn, but it's also like when I was talking, like bringing the energy down to the ceremonial magician, the hexagram and the pentagram are 5 and a 6. And so you're supposed to bring these kind of like two worlds into the spirit of the magician, right? I mentioned the magician. So 11 is very important, but it's also a number associated with very negative energies. And there was a guy in the Golden Dawn, his name was William Westcott, and he wrote, "Upon this number 11, it seems to have been the type of number with an evil reputation among all peoples. The Kabbalists contrasted it with the perfection of the decad. And just as the Sephirotic number is the form of all good things, so 11 is the essence of all that is sinful, harmful, and imperfect. In the 10 Sephiroth, they contrasted the 11 averse Sephiroth, symbols of destruction, violence, defeat, and death. So I think that these are important numbers. And then if you read his kind of master work or whatever that he supposedly received from Satan, Awas, he says in that, the book of the law, the number 11 is of us. So it's this common theme. Abrahadabra is an 11-letter words. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the laws, 11 words, 11 syllables. And so I think that this is a very important word for any type of operation. It's interesting that a lot of these intelligence agencies use some of their public workings, as they call it, operations, just like a ceremonial magician would use that word. But anyway, so like 11 is very important. And of course, 9/11 is the date, the plane. You can go back through and look at even the Twin Towers. The twin is an 11. It's really an ideogram. I mentioned the word ideogram earlier. So these magicians are kind of thinking on different terms. But I think that they're also thinking on kind of like the terms of aethers and different effects and structured events and things like that. But all those numbers can be traced back to and through Crowley. 11 being more. And if you remember, probably one of the, like for the real paranoiacs out there, one of the more important speeches was George Bush's famous New World Order speech on September 11th, 1990, 11 years to the date of the 9/11 event.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I was going to say, I just thought it was interesting. Again, COVID 19, October 7th for Israel. And so just so many things. You mentioned Bush towards the end, Poppy Bush. Isn't there this rumor that Barbara Bush could have been Aleister Crowley's daughter?
Right, it was her mother's name is Pierce. That was her mother, and like she was supposedly Barbara Bush looks like Aleister Crowley. She has the same headspace and stuff like that. So the physiognomy is the same. But the mother back in the day, Paris used to be like the city of lights. It's beautiful now. It's a global dump, just like almost every urban center in the Western world. Like the people just gave up hope, and like they're all fourth world countries almost. But back in the day, the Paris used to attract all of the cultured, rich people, artists, Rodin, who Crowley was friends with, sculptures, impressionists, those kind of things, writers, Hemingway. And she would go there. She was rich. I'm trying to remember what Rosalind Pierce or something. But she would kind of come, and Crowley was there at the time. After he got kicked out of Italy by Mussolini, he had a friend there named Roger Harris. And she was apparently friends with Roger Harris's girlfriend at the time, I think her name was, she had an Irish name. But Crowley at that time he was doing all these rituals that required servitors, so like people to assist. And the rumor is that this woman, Pierce, was impregnated and came back with, Barbara Pierce as Crowley's offspring. If you look at Crowley, he was kind of profligate in his sexual life, but also kids. I think he had 5 total kids. He didn't care anything about his children. He never spent time with them. I think he said about one, she'll make a good prostitute. Another was he named one of his sons Ataturk and never cared for him. And he ended up kind of like this, almost like a village idiot, like dressing up in stuff, dressing up in weird stuff and claiming to be Crowley. But, yeah, his offspring, he might have had a lot of offspring through these sexual rituals. He just didn't care. And so it kind of makes sense that Barbara Pierce, who became Barbara Bush, could be his offspring. The timing lines up. They look the same. They act the same. That whole family is very odd. They are, it's Skull and Bones, and they have their own library. It's almost basically like Harry Potter, which is interesting. We can get into another Crowley, and Harry Potter is a 5 and a 6, right? So that's an 11. It's not a mistake that they're using the word pottery, which is alchemy, clay into gold. And when Harry goes shopping for his first magic wand, you want to guess how the size of his magic wand? 11. It's 11 inches long. Of course it is. So So the likelihood that all these things kind of sync up in a really weird way. If you look at the relationship between Poppy Bush, who's a very evil person, and Barbara, they were kind of an arranged marriage. I think when they found each other, like when they either set up, he was 16 and she was 14. So it wasn't kind of like, and she comes from a very wealthy family, by the way. I can't remember the name of the magazine that her dad was the manager of, but it makes sense that it was kind of an elite WASP kind of thing going on there. And then you can go back. Prescott, all this 3 generations in a row are all bonesmen out of Yale. The darkest, really some of the most powerful group, drug dealing, murder, and just like rapation, the CIA. It just goes on and on. Like the real history, there's a real underground history of America that even the intellectuals in the paradigm of academic thought would never touch on. They just couldn't do it. They couldn't get away with it talking at some of these schools. But that's the real history of America, is this kind of underground occulted history, because some of these people were in power.
And to take it up to the present day, again, as you've talked about in your book, he wanted to create this sort of new religion and a new world, this new age, new world.
Sorry to interrupt, but he used the word aeon. So it's a distinctly different word than an age, much like Hitler. So there's overlap. So where Hitler was going to make 1,000-year Reich, and an aeon is 1,000 years. So Crowley was going to take the world from the age of Osiris to the age of Horus, which is the hawk-headed god from Egypt. So that was his whole kind of arc. He said that he called it the birth of the child, and he thought it was going to start in the 60s. So you can sync up kind of Crowley to the Beatles, and if you look at Beatles as a structure group like I do, that's it. Sorry to interrupt, but it's just another kind of a similarity between these occultists, whether political. Crowley was really political, by the way. He believed the optimal civilization, it sounds familiar to what we use today, but was a feudal system. He thought feudalism was great, and the average person was a cow, and they should be sheared and dispensed with, and he hated Christians and Jews. So
yeah, that was my next question. And again, what you just mentioned, the Third Reich or the Eon, that's Antichrist. Instead of waiting for Christ's 1,000-year reign, it's like, no, we're going to do a counterfeit Third Reich or
exactly.
Aeon. And so just to get your thought on where do you think we are currently with this new world religion that's now, come out of the work of Crowley and many of his associates. Lucis Trust is still going strong. There are many other institutes. I can't think of them now, and I'm only recently discovering them. Esalen, so many other institutes that are plugged into this sort of New Age network. Constance Kumbaya and others have talked about how it's almost like they refer to themselves like that. They don't even give themselves a name, and they're moving forward this work. And you write, Crowley clearly intended his new religion to be applied politically. He advocates a breeding program that would destroy any, quote, tainted stock, particularly Jews and Protestant Christians. Crowley considered Roman Catholics as essentially pagan. They would be allowed to live. You say, if necessary, force must be used to destroy the present system as represented by the slave gods, of which Crowley meant the monotheistic religions. And we're also seeing alt media now being flooded with this new ageism. I'm seeing article after article and podcast after podcast talking about Gnosticism. The God of the Old Testament is the demiurge. He's the Satan. Oh, but I'm not Gnostic, but that's what I believe. Or that Jesus was an alien who came down to mine the Middle East for resources. Or saying, Ron Unz's website, not him personally, but someone just posted an article saying we must do away with all of the Abrahamic religions. And I'm thinking, I was on Richard Grove's Grand Theft World. I mean, the guy's a brain. He's pulling out all these books that are highlighted, and we were talking about Richard Wurmbrand, and Wurmbrand wrote a
Marx
book,
and Satan.
Marx and Satan. And I mean, just the synergy of Richard Grove, like the guy blows my mind. He goes straight to this passage. I didn't even know this, where Wurmbrand speaks of two types of Zionism. And there's the one bad Zionism, which I think is what we are now witnessing. And he talks about like the good sort of Christianly Zionism, which is, full of love. You're supposed to love your neighbors. And I think, I have this, there's people talk about that third letter was Albert Pike or Mazzini or something. And, there's no source for that. but it's like the content of it seems to be coming to life. And so it's kind of like I feel the current state of Israel with its rabid Zionism and Netanyahu and the people running that show are actually being driven by an occult force whose purpose is to act so insanely with what they're doing in Gaza and elsewhere, so as to sort of discuss thoroughly world public opinion with Israel and Christianity, sort of in an attempt to ultimately have the world turn on Jews and Christianity and possibly Islam, so then they can transition to this sort of New Age occult world religion. And so any thoughts on where we are at with with what I just threw out there and the New Age world religion?
That is interesting. I hadn't heard that, but it's interesting tie-in too, because I think Grand Theft World, that guy, he was at 9/11 too, right? What didn't he? Wasn't he supposed to be in the towers or whatever?
Yeah, I think so.
It seems like it. It doesn't seem very like this is kind of like a Christian optimization of Israel. What's going on is clearly a genocide, and they dropped a nuke on Lebanon to kill those guys. It was a mini nuke. Nobody really wants to talk about that, and he's trying to get us to fight a war with Iran, which has 80 million people. Americans are looking like we're lucky that we haven't been bombed yet by either Russia or Iran. Like, we're in for a real reckoning. So it's bad. So especially in our support for this genocide, and Netanyahu, they need new leadership in Israel. And it is interesting. You kind of see, maybe even in the Old Testament and in this stream, even up to Jesus Christ, is that there's people who are trying to find the best things in the Bible, and people who are just savage, like, we're God's people and we're going to kill everybody and we're against the Romans and all that. And it's interesting because I've been listening to a lot of Geopolitics, a lot of guys you've had on your show, and they're saying, like, there was something from one of the leaders in Israel that said Jews are going to start killing Jews again. And it made me think of the fall of AD, like when Jerusalem was sacked. Because one of the reasons it was sacked is that inside Jerusalem at the time, there were different factions fighting each other too within Judaism. And it just made me think, like, it's a shame that this could happen again. But Richard Grove, I can't remember. Richard Grove is the guy. I've heard his story about 9/11. But it is interesting that all eyes are back on the Holy Land again. It is really something else. What do you think about what's happening?
Regarding Israel?
Yeah, Israel and the current situation and the genocide.
I'm trying to make sense of it. I've been doing that on the podcast with guests of differing opinion, and I don't know. I mean, in the sense where I don't know how to interpret events. Obviously, I've said this for the longest time. Some listeners are trying to crucify me. It's like, I've had on Gideon Levy, right? The Israeli journalist who's been speaking out, like I think it was 2019. So please, if you're going to come to me with like, okay, check my archives, please, people, check my archives. But, obviously what the Israeli state is doing, I think. I mean, and it's just coming out, Louis Theroux, the BBC, I haven't watched it yet.
The Settlers, yeah.
Like that. I mean, it's clear. And these people doing this to the Palestinians are not Christians. They hate Christianity. They've rejected Christ. And so we are supporting them. And so obviously what they're doing cannot be supported in any good conscience way from a Christian perspective. At the same time, I'm still open to the idea that the creation of the state of Israel could have been a prophetic event. But obviously what they're doing, they're not Christians. They've rejected Christ. They're killing people. Obviously that's kind of like where the buck stops. And so I'm kind of like in the middle. I don't know. There's also the Christian theology that says, the creation of the state of Israel has nothing to do with a prophecy, like Chuck Baldwin explains. And so, but yeah, obviously what they're doing is not right. And they just keep expanding. And there's talk of this third temple, none of that is, I mean, the Bible has talked about, right, a third temple, but obviously that wouldn't be like, it's an antichrist thing. So it's like kind of
where's the Bible? Where's the God? Where did God say build the third temple? Somebody find me that quote or whatever. Yeah.
Well, it implies,
or the red heifer, right? The red heifer. That's pretty kind of sketchy prophecy too. Is like the red heifer prophecy too. But they're planning on that as well.
Well, yeah, and the temple being built, the Bible implies it's going to be for the Antichrist. It's not for Jesus or God,
Then why are all of these political leaders from all over the world sitting in front of the hotel with the yarmulke praying? Like, what's going on? Like, what's the Christian world? What's the proper Christian worldview?
I've been to the Wailing Wall. I've been to Israel. I've stood on the Temple Mount, and I've been to that wall. But I don't remember if I touched it or not. But I think more I came there, and I just stood there and looked at it and trying to like absorb the vibe, like what's going on. And but yeah, it's getting. But again, it just makes sense that they're going to do something insane, and maybe Third World War. And that's going to be used as the pretext is to say, look at these Jews and Christians and Muslims. They're insane. We got to get rid of them. And here comes, here's your new age world, green religion, right. Universalist, Baha'i, all this stuff we've been talking about the past hour or two. And just any thought on where do you see this new world religion? Do you see it everywhere?
I wanted
to ask, even the Pepe the Frog meme, I realized recently, I used to share some stuff because it was funny, but in your book you talk about how if the frog, Crowley used the frog,
frog,
right, as to how do you say, like to disparage Christ. And again, it's these, we were talking about these. There's this this strange undercurrent of occultism and Nazism and alternative media today, and the frog apparently is this occult symbol. So I kind of like stopped having anything to do with Pepe the Frog, because again, I see that related to this occult stuff. So just the thoughts on that and where you see the whole new age world religion at today.
Well, the Christians are holding back a paradise, right? So the Christians have to go. So they're the one, according to Barbara Marx Hubbard, right? A fourth of the world has to go, and our paradise is somewhere else. So I think that Crowley fits directly into the New World Order. That's, most people maybe at a first glance would never put his ideas and his religion together with the New World Order, but I think that they're included with these other people, Blavatsky, Lucis Trust, but they all kind of overlap in the same kind of occult hierarchy. And I'm learning more about the Rockefeller brothers and how dark they are, and the foundation. I mean, it's interesting because they built the UN and the World Trade Center at the same time, same family. But I think that we are entering this kind of time of tribulation or troubles. I'm not a one of these people who believes like people are going to be rescued from the tribulation or whatever. So these are definitely interesting times. I don't know, like the weird frog thing. Wasn't there something in the Bible? Something comes to mind, like in the Bible, wasn't like in the Revelation, the frogs were sent out, or some being like frogs, to trick the entire world into Armageddon or something like that?
Yeah, like it was like a false spirit, like the frogs came out.
There was something involved in like end times revelation involving frogs, which is a kind of a disturbing thing when you talk about Pepe or something like that.
Yeah, but even recently, like I read something definitive in current occult literature. Again, the frog is a symbol that is anti Christian.
I didn't know that.
I guess one of my final questions you write in your book towards the end, you talk about the New World Order. You write, supranational institutions and agreements will assure the aggregation of greater wealth into fewer hands, forming a new serf world, a prison planet. And that's what I focus on a lot. We're seeing talk of integrating Canada, USA, Mexico, Greenland. That's the old 1939 Atlantic Union project of these same British occult globalists that are in these same circles with Crowley. And how close do you see us to their purported endgame of world?
It seems like they're putting it together. I mean, isn't it interesting that Trump, this kind of like guy who's going to change everything, is trying to like put things together, fused for these last 10 kingdoms at world's end, as the Bible, states at Revelation. So I think it's crazy. And I think we've just seen this former, in really almost one or two generations. Like my dad could buy a house, a car, and pay off his student loans in like 3 or 4 years. So we've seen the complete evisceration, and I would call enslavement. I'm happy to say the average American is enslaved if like 50% cannot afford a $500 bill and are constantly in debt. You've been enslaved by your own government. You are a serf. You're a debt serf and a techno serf a different kind of serf, but you're basically a serf. So I think that Crowley's ideology has already been done. I think it's already fait accompli. I don't think like you have to look on the horizon, and you can add in all the mind control and all this other stuff. But I think that we're going to have to find a way out of it. And I don't think that Trump's going to help you, really, honestly. So, I mean, I think that Crowley's quotes are really important. That's why I include them in the book. And like one of the quotes I repeat all the time is this outlook I think these guys have. Bush seniors called us useless eaters. We know that. This is a Crowley quote. We should have no compunction in utilizing the natural qualities of the bulk of mankind. We do not insist on trying to train sheep to hunt foxes or lecture on history. We look after their physical well-being and enjoy their wool and mutton. In this way, we shall have a contented class of slaves who accept the conditions of existence as they really are and enjoy life with the quiet wisdom of the cattle. People have all adapted to this mentality. They've accepted no health care, criminality, not having a house, being in debt constantly. They've turned you into maybe a semi-contented class of slaves, and I think Crowley would approve. So I think we're there.
Yeah, we are there in the neo-feudalism. Again, it seems like the end game, and I'm just shocked. I see it everywhere. I talk about the real estate. I talk about it constantly with people in real life. It's the same here in Mexico and in Croatia and the United States. Like housing tripled in the last decade. Like if I hadn't bought my house, I would not be able to own a home anymore, and probably for most people. And I think it's deliberate, it's intentional. And the wages have stayed the same. Like how is this an accident? It's not accidental that globally, like I go back to the US or here in Mexico, if I go back to where I used to work, it's the same wage 10 years ago, but the houses are 3 times the price. And food is at least double, and energy. Like, how is that not intentional?
It's intentional. There's no question about it. The other kicker is that your rulers are taking your tax money that you've, sweated and, had tears over, and offshoring it globally to their own hidden accounts. Almost all of them are doing it, at least in the United States. And nothing's happening yet. There's been no arrest about that. I mean, they're trying to give people a little bit of freedom or some kind of idea like something's happening because they got some criminals out of here who are illegal. That's nothing. There's 50 or 100,000 people who've stolen hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars from the treasury or from the people here that haven't been addressed yet. I mean, it's incredible. It's off the charts.
I do have to ask, for writing a book like yours, you have quite the strong stomach for being able to research this madness. Has it affected you? How are you able to
for sure. I don't think there's any doubt. I think it's faith. I think I was called to do this type of work, and I was prepped for it because I went through people don't know my authentic real history. I haven't really divulged it, but I already went. I mean, I worked on the death of Vince Foster when I was in 96. So people ask me these things. A lot of people, I've seen a lot of people die, and I've been very blessed and fortunate to make it this far. So I've accomplished a lot with the help of God. No question.
Well, keep on trucking. Any final thought for us, or let us know where the best places to find you and all that?
I have so many shows on Crowley and things like that, and the Children of the Beast. You can read the books. They're all available on Amazon. If you like signed copies, you can go to William Ramsey Investigates. I've had a bunch of different guests. I've had a couple of your recent guests who were great. And you got to be careful, and I think a lot of the Christian leaders, not all, but they've been compromised, and their discernment isn't that as good as I'd like it to be. And they're kind of into dark times. These are dark times. There's tons of lies. There's so many black propagandists out there lying about everything. The U.S. literally invaded Russia. They call it a proxy war. It's totally fake. You should be really concerned about the non-declaration of war when you're at war with Russia. It's a pseudo proxy war. So wake up. And I think we're already in World War III. So, I mean, I think that if you're walking around hey, we might get there, we're there. There's tons of people moving around. North Koreans were fighting at the front 7,000 miles away.
Chinese also.
Chinese too. So like, and then if you know history, like I know a lot about history. These things, they don't happen right away. The anger builds up and pressure builds up. World War I builds up. World War II is the same thing. These slaughters didn't have, like the invasion of Russia, there were abuses that happened 2 or 3 years in advance that made people more and more angry. We're at that kind of pressure cooker point. Everybody's angry. Hindus are angry with, India's angry with Pakistan. The Middle East is another fireball. The US people are angry. And Russians are never going to get over getting invaded again. And every time they got invaded, they won. So we invaded them. They're going to look at Americans with contempt. I'm sorry, but like, you're not getting the right information. You're becoming a hated person around the world because of granted, I know you're in Mexico, but like, people are making decisions for the rest of the United States that influences the rest of us. Hitler, I bet those people in Germany never expected that the start of the war, their whole country would be bombed and invaded and partitioned. And I think the Americans are kind of in the same thing. We don't know what's going to happen next. This isn't World War II. It's worse. There's hypersonic bombs, international things going on, drone strikes. And wake up and stay safe. And you need God in your life and Christ. These are the most important themes ever, is getting close with God and trying to figure out through Christ, obviously, like I'm a one way, all the way Christ, but like find your place in this present world. Are you supporting this? I saw a really interesting one, listened to an interesting podcast with Monica Perez. She had a guy on from South Africa that resonated with me. It was about de-stating, like stop relying on the state and rely on self-reliance. And so I think that's an important theme. And also, think for yourself, like do the reading yourself, read the Bible yourself. I was on a long drive recently. I was listening to the New Testament and Acts again. It's still refreshing. It still has meaning. I still see different parts of it I didn't see. Now that I'm 56, it's like, oh, I understand what happened there now. So, keep your faith. Christ is King. And it's going to be turbulent from here on out.
But William, you talk about hypersonics. Nukes don't exist. I'm being silly. Again, it's one of those things out there. I've told this. I've stood on ground zero that was radioactive. How do you guys explain that? But anyways, and I did recently watch an interview of people talking about that. I wasn't convinced. But anyways, what you mentioned, India, Pakistan. All right, I think that was another false flag operation trying to get the party started, probably from the same Western deep state. Forces.
It wouldn't be the first.
No, and in South Korea, again, we see this trend now. I think one of the most important topics is false flag operations, because we had in South Korea, they attempted a false flag, in my opinion, the martial law installation, and probably to start fighting with North Korea. Seems like they're ready to go now soon. As you said, it's slowly, the fire is building. Ukraine, Gaza, Asia now, China, Philippines, South China Sea, Taiwan, Japan. Maybe they were going to try the false flag with South Korea and North. That didn't work. I read recently, there were enough patriotic South Korean military men who stopped it. It's like they failed there. They're not all powerful, these globalist freaks. And then India, Pakistan, they're like, okay, let's throw the match over there by Kashmir. And then the what just happened, Spain and Portugal, lights out. It's like someone pointed on X, it's like literally a month ago, the Fourth Reich, the new European Soviet, Brussels comes out, EU, saying, hey, you guys need to prepare for a 72-day prep. What a coincidence. A month later, the lights go out. It's like, well, you guys were planning this. This was done by, no, wouldn't you say that this was a complete false flag operation?
I wouldn't be surprised. Nothing would surprise me. There's so many false flags. Interestingly, who was in London in 7/7? Do you know what state leader was there? Benjamin Netanyahu. He literally reported from that. 10/7 is totally fake, by the way, guys. It's proven. It's not me. People think like I come up with it myself. I get information from guys who read the Israeli media, they're the ones saying it's fake. Like these Jews, I don't know, they must be anti-Semites or something. But false flags are almost kind of the rule, sad to say. Like they're a rule in at least 20th century history.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at I looked at this years ago, but yeah, it's clear that it was a false. Because again, you go back to the London, it was that same day. I remember in July of 2005, I was at a U2 conference concert in Milan, Italy, as well as Rome, and I remember Bono. He is a globalist, yeah, I know, okay, but he was saying actually that I'm remembering now. I got my news from Bono. I hadn't even know it occurred. And it was like right after the July 7th. I have to check the dates on when the conference took place. And Bono says something about London. I'm like, what happened? I don't know. And again, but you read, there's books on this that look at it from an academic perspective. They were running, it's just like 9/11. The British authorities, local police were running simulations of attacks on like the trains. And what do you know what actually happened? And when Madrid, you discover the same. Like, how many times do they have to run simulations of the thing that actually happens? With COVID, with 9/11, with London, with Madrid. I mean, it's absolutely insanity. And for someone to call us crazy, like they're literally running simulations every single time. And I just want to throw out, just for fun, J.D. Vance visits the Pope and the Pope passes, and then J.D. Vance goes to India, and then you have the flare up in Pakistan. In India. Wow. That's weird. That's weird.
Weird. And his connections are weird too, man. It's amazing. Like it's the real history of the 20th century is hidden. Like you just exposed the entire history of the real history, not what they're telling us. And I think Putin said like 90% of those things were run by the CIA, all those explosions and stuff like that. So I tend to believe him.
Well, I'm not sure if he said that. I also do believe that, you know, Russia has carried out the false flags, like the Moscow apartment bombings in 1999.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
it's just all over the place. But
didn't that benefit Putin?
Yeah. It was like the Russian version of 9/11 and global war on terror, where he can go into Chechnya, shore up the Russian security state, and all that. I don't know. I am trying to think of China. I don't know enough. I think this the thing is, the West seems to be the core node or headquarters of the globalist empire, and so they're more advanced and I think more powerful than the East, obviously, and so they're able to, in higher quantity, carry out these types of events. But you know, the Japanese did it during World War II in Manchuria, where they dressed up as was it Chinese and attacked the railway station, which was used as a pretext for Japan to take. Right. And so
Hitler did the same thing. Do you know that Hitler had his own favorite guy? His name was like. Now look up Now Jocks. He had his own false flag specialist, so he would do it on the Eastern Front and the Western Front, bodies and all this stuff.
I'm only familiar with obviously the Reichstag in '33 and then 1939, the Gleiwitz incident, where they blamed they dressed up Germans as Polish soldiers and attacked their own radio.
Excellent. Yeah, your grasp of history is superb. There was another one that happened before they invaded Belgium, is my understanding. There was another false flag, the same guy, but they all these leaders have like a black actor or something like that who carries out all these.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, even in Mexico, the Tlatelolco, 1968, where Mexican authorities fired on the Mexican youth protesters, and they said that they were shot at first, but it was probably their false flag operator shooting at the Mexican authorities, who could then use that as pretext to massacre Mexicans. And that was the president at the time was a CIA agent. So it's just absolutely never ending. This is like the post, we're now entering like the after hours of our podcast. But anyways, finally, thank you for coming on the first time in Politics and Empire, William. All your links are in the description. I urge people to check out your books and follow you on X and subscribe to William Ramsey Investigates on Apple, on Spotify. Thank you, William.
Thank you. God bless. Thanks for having me.